Welcome back to Liberty Bites on the Think Liberty Network. I'm your host, William Gadsden. You can follow me personally on Twitter at William_Gadsden and follow Think Liberty on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever your favorite social media outlet is. You can also follow me on Facebook at William Gadsden Political Commentator. Give us a follow and a like for updates on new episodes and more. We also have a Patreon now, so if you'd like to support our work, check it out at patreon.com/ThinkLibertyPatrons. Today we're going to talk about what is probably the most destructive Supreme Court case in American history, a case that has slowly been smothering American liberty in its cradle ever since. A case that threw open the doors for vast, unchecked expansions of federal power, doors that haven't been closed to this day. I'm talking, of course, about McColluch v. Maryland. Now, before we discuss the case itself, the massive impact that it's had on the growth of government power, let's do a quick review on the powers derived from the Constitution for the federal government. This basically comes down to two different forms of power: enumerated powers and implied powers. Enumerated powers are those that are expressly reserved for the federal government, specifically in Article 1 of the Constitution. Implied powers are those that are interpreted from the Constitution or implied by the Constitution. Many of these are justified by the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause, which is found in Article 1, Section 8. It states that Congress has the power to, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or any department or officer thereof, unquote. In other words, the federal government can take action or make laws doing something, as long as the end goal is to meet or achieve one of the responsibilities outlined elsewhere in Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, using a broad interpretation of this clause, the federal government can justify the enacting of a law or creation of a new department, etc., as long as they can tie it into another part of Article 1. Obviously, I don't need to spell out for you how dangerous this can be, and has proven to be. But I'm going to anyway because, hey, you chose to listen to this episode. So now let's get into the details of the case itself. In 1791, Congress established a national bank. Now, all of the issues with centralized banking aside, there is clearly no expressed authority in the Constitution giving Congress the power to create a national bank. So obviously, a lot of folks had a big problem with this. The two sides of this issue were led by our old friends Jefferson and Hamilton. Even this soon after the ratification of the Constitution, these two had fundamental disagreements on how it should be read. Jefferson, the staunch anti-federalist, insisted that the enumerated powers of the Constitution were the only powers given to the federal government, and all others were reserved for the states or the people per the 10th Amendment. Hamilton, on the other hand, said screw that and insisted that the federal government was allowed to do whatever wasn't expressly forbidden by the Constitution. Pretty radical differences. Anyway, the first national bank ended up being created despite protests from the Jeffersonians. But it wasn't challenged in court until the creation of the second national bank in 1816, due to the charter of the first national bank expiring and the subsequent delaying actions taken by the Jeffersonian Republicans. So when the second national bank was created, blowback was inevitable. This took the form of the state of Maryland attempting to tax transactions done by the National Bank branch located in Baltimore, ostensibly to shore up massive losses to private banks in the area that were being exacerbated by the existence of the National Bank. Once this case reached the Supreme Court, two major political questions had to be answered. One, did Congress have the power to create the National Bank in the first place, since it isn't expressly given that power in the Constitution? And two, was Maryland overstepping its bounds by attempting to tax a federal organization? This would be the first major battle between those supporting less centralized government and those supporting more centralized government. Chief Justice John Marshall, the Federalist judge that you'll remember from our previous episode, presided over the court and delivered the majority opinion. Spoiler alert, this is where the smothering begins. Marshall decides that yes, Congress does have the authority to create a national bank, but the justification for it is far more important here. So Marshall takes the Hamiltonian view of the Constitution, saying that the Constitution is simply too complex to list every single thing that the government is allowed to do. Because of that, the framers included the necessary and proper clause. And what about all of these things that the government will, quote, need to do in the future? Using this as a foundation for his argument, Marshall outlines the difference between enumerated and implied powers, thusly opening the door for vast federal growth in the rest of American history. Furthermore, states do not have the right to regulate the federal government, even in their own jurisdictions, due to the supremacy clause of the Constitution. Now, to be fair, he did try to keep it relatively in check, saying that enumerated powers are the ends and implied powers are the means to those ends. Thus, creating a bank would be the means to the enumerated power of collecting taxes, borrowing money, regulating commerce, etc. But it isn't an end unto itself. Nevertheless, Pandora's box had been opened. To make things worse, Marshall introduces even more room for a fluid interpretation, saying, quote, "Let the end be legitimate, and all means which consist of the spirit of the Constitution are constitutional," unquote. Never mind that the spirit of the Constitution itself is up for huge amounts of interpretation and are, in the end, subjective to whoever is deciding what that spirit is. So what's wrong with all of this? Take the issue of the national bank, states' rights, etc. off the table. And as far as what government will need to do in the future, well, that's why we have an amendment process, so that's an easy one. But the primary issue here is that despite Article 1 of the Constitution and the clear support of the Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution in the 10th Amendment, a more open, fluid interpretation of federal power was introduced, and then cemented by this majority opinion. This gives carte blanche to whoever is in power at the time to create new powers for the federal government as long as it is ostensibly pursuant to something else in the Constitution. We have seen this over and over again in recent history alone, with new government organizations and agencies being created out of thin air to address this or that crisis, and then they never really go away even after the crisis has been addressed. But it can be used for so much worse. Want nationalization of certain industries? Fine. Just pass a law and say that it's pursuant to the Commerce Clause. Want to ban certain types of firearms or introduce universal health care or rent controls or price caps across the country? No problem. Just point to the General Welfare Clause. The problem basically comes down to this. The original intent of the Constitution was to restrict the actions of the federal government to keep it from becoming overbearing or tyrannical. But restricting the federal government requires clear lines of allowance and restriction, ones that aren't up for fluid, flexible interpretation. As soon as a flexible interpretation is enshrined by a judicial power, especially the highest judicial power in the land, that enabling of growth will be taken advantage of immediately. And it has been, consistently and ruthlessly, to the detriment of our own liberty. Join me next time as we discuss a hot topic in today's political environment of late, term limits, in the major court case of U.S. Term Limits Incorporated v. Thornton. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us next time to become more liberty-centered with us. I'm William Gadsden with Think Liberty.